Texas just shook in a way it has not shaken in over a century. And the strangest part is not how strong the earthquake was, it is where it happened. Early Thursday morning, while most of the Texas Panhandle was still asleep, the ground beneath Spearman and Miami, Texas suddenly lurched with enough force to rattle homes as far away as Amarillo, Lubbock, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa, and to be felt more than 200 miles away in Kansas. This was not the kind of place anyone expects a serious earthquake to happen. And that single fact is exactly why scientists are now scrambling to figure out what just occurred beneath the surface of one of the flattest, most seismically quiet regions in the entire country. The numbers alone are striking. The United States Geological Survey measured the quake at magnitude 5.0, striking at approximately 5:21 in the morning local time, with an epicenter roughly 24 miles southeast of Spearman, and northwest of the small town of Miami. According to official USGS records, this is the strongest earthquake recorded in the Texas Panhandle in more than a century, and only the fourth earthquake of magnitude 4.0 or greater ever documented in that specific region, going back to the year 1900. For context, the closest comparison on record is a magnitude 4.9 event that struck Carson County back in 1925, exactly 101 years ago. Everything else on the historical list barely cracks magnitude 4.5. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what makes the Texas Panhandle geologically unusual in the first place. Unlike California, Alaska, or other well-known earthquake zones, the Panhandle sits far from the boundaries of Earth's major tectonic plates, the massive slabs of crust whose collisions and grinding movements are responsible for the vast majority of earthquakes recorded around the world. Regions like this are sometimes described by geologists as intraplate zones, meaning they sit deep inside the interior of a tectonic plate rather than along its edges. Earthquakes can still happen in these zones, but they are supposed to be rare, and they are supposed to be small. A magnitude 5.0 event breaks both of those assumptions at once. The earthquake struck at a relatively shallow depth of about 3.5 miles below the surface, and that shallow depth is part of why so many people across such a wide area actually felt it. Shallow earthquakes tend to transmit more energy directly upward toward the surface, rather than dissipating that energy as it travels through deeper layers of rock, which is why residents as far as Kinsley, Kansas, nearly 200 miles from the epicenter, reported feeling the shaking. Closer to the epicenter, in towns across the Panhandle, residents described being jolted awake by a loud rumble, followed by rough, 20 seconds of noticeable shaking, strong enough to knock items off shelves and, in some cases, cause people to briefly lose their balance. Fortunately, as of the most recent reporting, no injuries or significant structural damage had been confirmed. But the United States Geological Survey received hundreds of did-you-feel-it reports within hours of the quake, an unusually high volume for a region that almost never registers seismic activity at all, let alone activity strong enough to be felt across 4 states. Emergency officials say aftershocks remain possible in the days following an event of this magnitude, and seismologists are continuing to monitor the region closely for any additional movement along whatever fault actually ruptured. That question, which fault actually ruptured and why, is where this story turns from simple news reporting into genuine scientific mystery. Seismologists studying the region have said plainly that they do not yet know the cause, that additional data will be needed before they can determine with confidence what triggered an earthquake of this size in a place that essentially never produces earthquakes like this naturally. Geologists explain that ancient, long-dormant faults do exist beneath the Panhandle, buried deep under layers of sediment that have accumulated over tens of millions of years. Under the right conditions, stress can build along one of these ancient faults until it finally slips, releasing energy that has been slowly accumulating, in some cases, for centuries. But there's a second, far more politically and scientifically loaded possibility that researchers are also examining closely, and it is one that has become an increasingly familiar part of earthquake investigations across Texas over the past decade: the role of oil and gas operations. Specifically, scientists want to know whether underground pressure changes linked to industrial activity. Most commonly, the injection of wastewater deep underground as part of oil and gas extraction may have contributed to reactivating a fault that would otherwise have remained quiet. This is not a hypothetical concern invented for this particular earthquake. It is a pattern with a well-documented scientific track record in other parts of the state. In West Texas, particularly in the Permian Basin region around Pecos, earthquakes tied to oil and gas wastewater disposal have become a recurring and increasingly serious concern over the past several years. A 2021 study conducted by researchers from the United States Geological Survey and the University of Texas found that the vast majority of seismic activity recorded near Pecos over the previous 2 decades was likely triggered by increased wastewater injection rather than by natural tectonic processes. That same period saw the number of earthquakes measuring magnitude 3.0 or greater in Texas roughly double in a single year, a statistic that alarmed both scientists and residents living near active drilling and injection sites. The mechanism behind this kind of triggered seismicity is fairly well understood at this point, even if predicting exactly when and where it will happen remains extremely difficult. During hydraulic fracturing and conventional oil extraction, enormous volumes of salty, contaminated water come up to the surface alongside the oil itself, often several barrels of wastewater for every single barrel of oil produced. Rather than treating and releasing that contaminated water, the industry standard practice is to inject it deep underground into disposal wells. When that injected water reaches ancient fault lines that have been sitting quietly for thousands or even millions of years, it can effectively lubricate the fault, reducing the friction that was keeping it locked in place and allowing built-up tectonic stress to finally release in the form of an earthquake. Residents who have lived through this pattern in other parts of Texas describe the experience in visceral terms. One longtime farmer in Reeves County, describing a separate earthquake in that region, said it felt like a truck had hit his house and recalled that an earlier, smaller quake years before had left a broad bulge across his land, cracking underground pipes and damaging the gravity-fed irrigation system his farm depended on. Stories like that have become increasingly common across parts of West Texas, as the frequency of induced seismic activity has climbed alongside the expansion of oil and gas wastewater disposal operations in the region. Whether that same dynamic played any role in Thursday's Panhandle earthquake remains genuinely unknown, and officials have been careful not to jump to conclusions. Investigators will likely examine the location of nearby injection wells, the volume and timing of wastewater disposal activity in the surrounding area, and the precise characteristics of the fault that ruptured before drawing any firm conclusions about whether human activity played a role or whether this was a naturally occurring event along one of the region's ancient, ordinarily dormant fault systems. That kind of careful, methodical investigation typically takes weeks or months, not days, particularly for a region with such a limited historical earthquake record to compare against. What makes this particular case scientifically interesting, beyond the immediate question of cause, is how rare it is for the Panhandle specifically to register this kind of activity at all, regardless of what ultimately caused it. The oil and gas-related seismicity that has become increasingly well documented in Texas over the past decade has been concentrated overwhelmingly in the Permian Basin region of West Texas, hundreds of miles to the southwest of where Thursday's earthquake struck. The Panhandle has its own separate history of oil and gas activity, but it has not historically been associated with the same kind of induced seismicity pattern seen further south, which is part of why this event has caught seismologists' attention so sharply. There is also a broader scientific conversation happening around how researchers distinguish between natural and human-triggered earthquakes in the first place, and it is worth understanding because it directly shapes how seriously to take any single event like this one. Seismologists studying earthquakes presumed to be linked to industrial activity typically look for a specific set of clues, including whether the earthquake's location correlates closely with active injection wells, whether the timing lines up with recent changes in injection volume or pressure, and whether the earthquake occurred at a depth consistent with the layers of rock where wastewater is typically injected. Independent researchers who track and analyze seismic data as a public service have previously flagged other Texas earthquakes as presumed anthropogenic, meaning human-caused, based on exactly this kind of pattern matching analysis, even before official state investigations reached their own conclusions. The Texas Railroad Commission, which despite its name is the state agency responsible for regulating oil and gas operations, including wastewater disposal wells, has a track record of launching investigations following significant seismic events elsewhere in the state. In one earlier case, inspectors were dispatched to investigate a magnitude 5.4 earthquake recorded near the border of Reeves and Culberson counties. An event that, at the TI, was described as the largest earthquake recorded in Texas since 1995, and the third largest in the state's recorded history. That investigation, like others before it, focused heavily on nearby wastewater disposal activity as a potential contributing factor. Whether a similar investigation will be launched for Thursday's Panhandle earthquake, and what it might ultimately conclude, remains to be seen. But the pattern across Texas over the past several years has been fairly consistent. When an earthquake significantly exceeds the historical norm for its specific region, industrial activity becomes one of the first and most seriously considered explanations, precisely because the scientific record increasingly supports that connection in so many other parts of the state. There's also a psychological and social dimension to an earthquake like this that goes beyond the purely scientific investigation into its cause. The Texas Panhandle is not a region where residents grow up thinking about earthquake preparedness the way people do in California or other well-known seismic zones. Homes in the region are generally not built with the same earthquake-resistant construction standards used in more seismically active parts of the country. simply because, until relatively recently, there was little practical reason to expect they would ever need them. An event like this one forces both residents and local officials to reconsider assumptions about risk that had gone essentially unquestioned for generations. Emergency management officials across the affected region spent Thursday fielding an unusually high volume of calls and reports from residents unfamiliar with what an earthquake actually feels like, since for many people in the area, this was likely the first earthquake they had ever experienced directly in their entire lives. That unfamiliarity itself is part of the story, a reminder of just how genuinely unusual this event was for a part of the country that has spent most of its recorded history without any meaningful earthquake activity at all. If stories like this, the kind of event that quietly forces scientists to re-examine assumptions about an entire region, are what you come here for, go ahead and like and subscribe so you catch the next one, because see, investigations like this one often reveal far more once the full data comes in than what is known in the first 24 hours. Historical context adds an important layer to understanding just how exceptional Thursday's earthquake really was. According to independent earthquake tracking services, this event ties for the 6th biggest earthquake ever recorded in the state of Texas, a genuinely remarkable ranking for an event that struck in a region with almost no prior seismic history of note. Notably, 2 have occurred just last year, both in West Texas, both widely linked by researchers to oil and gas wastewater disposal activity in that region. Seeing multiple record-setting or near-record-setting earthquakes occur across the state within such a short span of time is itself part of what has some scientists increasingly focused on the broader question of how industrial activity across Texas may be reshaping the state's underlying seismic risk profile. It is worth being careful here, because correlation is not the same as proven causation, and seismologists are the first to caution against assuming every unusual earthquake in Texas must automatically be linked to oil and gas activity, simply because that pattern has held true in other better studied cases. Natural earthquakes along ancient dormant faults absolutely do still occur, and researchers emphasize that ruling out a natural cause requires the same rigorous, evidence-based process as confirming an industrial one. That is precisely why officials have been careful to describe Thursday's earthquake as still under active investigation, rather than rushing to attribute it to any single cause before the data actually supports that conclusion. What scientists can say with confidence, even this early, is that an earthquake of this magnitude, in this specific location, represents a genuine departure from what more than a century of seismic records led researchers to expect from the region. Whether the eventual explanation turns out to be a natural release of ancient tectonic stress, a consequence of industrial wastewater disposal, or some combination of contributing G factors that amplified a fault that was already under natural stress, the event itself has already accomplished something notable. It has forced seismologists to take a harder, more serious look at a part of Texas that has spent the better part of the last 100 years being treated as seismically unremarkable. That reassessment carries real practical consequences beyond pure scientific curiosity. If investigators do eventually determine that industrial activity played any meaningful role in Thursday's earthquake, it would extend the geographic footprint of documented induced seismicity in Texas significantly further north than the areas that have received the most regulatory and scientific attention up to this point. That would raise new questions for regulators, energy companies, and residents alike about whether current safety and monitoring standards, largely developed in response to seismicity patterns observed in West Texas, are adequate for a region that had not previously been considered at meaningful risk. For now, residents across the Panhandle are left in a familiar but uncomfortable position, waiting for scientists to finish an investigation whose timeline nobody can fully predict, while living with the knowledge that aftershocks remain possible in the meantime. Seismologists continue monitoring instruments across the region closely, watching for any additional activity along whatever fault system produced Thursday's shaking, information that will ultimately help determine not just what happened this time, but how seriously to take the possibility of it happening again. There is a national dimension to this story too, one that extends well beyond Texas state lines. The United States as a whole has seen a measurable rise in induced seismicity over the past 15 years, largely concentrated in states with significant oil and gas production, that's including Oklahoma, which experienced its own dramatic surge in earthquake activity beginning around 2009, closely tracked by researchers, to the expansion of wastewater disposal wells across the state. Oklahoma's experience is often cited by seismologists as the clearest large-scale case study of induced seismicity in American history, a state that went from recording just a handful of earthquakes a year to recording hundreds, before regulatory intervention aimed at limiting injection volumes eventually helped bring that activity back down. Some researchers now wonder whether Thursday's Panhandle earthquake, so close to the Oklahoma border and clearly felt across that state as well, might reflect a similar dynamic, slowly expanding into new territory. Seismic monitoring infrastructure itself is part of what makes investigating an event like this one so complicated. Regions with a long history of significant earthquake activity, like California, have dense networks of seismic sensors designed to capture detailed data, ON, fault behavior, and aftershock patterns. Regions like the Texas Panhandle, historically considered low risk, generally have far sparser sensor coverage, simply because there was little perceived need to invest heavily in monitoring infrastructure for a type of event assumed to be exceedingly rare. That gap in monitoring capacity means researchers investigating Thursday's earthquake may have less detailed data available to work with than they would in a region already equipped with dense seismic networks. There is also an economic angle to this story that deserves attention, particularly for residents and business owners across the Panhandle, assessing what an earthquake like this might mean going forward. Agricultural operations across the region, including cattle, ranching, and grain farming that form a significant part of the local economy, generally were not designed with seismic risk in mind, from irrigation infrastructure to grain storage facilities. If earthquakes of this magnitude turn out to become a recurring rather than one-time event in the region, agricultural operators may eventually need to consider infrastructure investments similar to those already made by farmers in more seismically active parts of West Texas, where cracked pipes and damaged irrigation systems have become an increasingly familiar, if unwelcome, cost of doing business near active fault zones. Insurance considerations add another practical layer to this conversation. Standard homeowners insurance policies in much of Texas have not historically included earthquake coverage as a standard feature, again reflecting the historical assumption that earthquake risk in most of the state was negligible outside of the specific West Texas regions already known for induced seismicity. An event like Thursday's earthquake, striking a region far outside that established risk zone, may prompt both residents and insurers to reconsider whether that assumption still holds, particularly if follow-up investigation determines that industrial activity extends earthquake risk further across the state than previously assumed. Scientists studying long-term seismic hazard maps, the tools used by engineers, regulators, and insurers to assess earthquake risk across different regions, say that maps are only as good as the data underlying them. And that data is necessarily backward-looking, built from decades or centuries of historical earthquake records. When a region with an extremely limited historical record suddenly produces an event as significant as Thursday's earthquake, it does not necessarily mean the underlying hazard map was wrong, but it does mean researchers need to seriously re-examine whether that map accurately reflects current conditions, especially in an era where human industrial activity is increasingly capable of introducing seismic risk that simply did not exist when those historical records were first compiled. None of this is to suggest that Panhandle residents should expect earthquakes to become a routine part of life in the region. Even accounting for Thursday's event, the Panhandle remains a region with a dramatically lower baseline earthquake risk than areas like the Permian Basin or well-established seismic zones like California and Alaska. But scientists studying this event emphasize that dramatically lower is not the same as zero, and that Thursday's earthquake serves as a useful, if unsettling, reminder that seismic risk assessments need to remain flexible and open to revision as new data comes in, rather than treated as permanently fixed conclusions based purely on historical precedent. For seismologists, an event like this one also represents a genuinely valuable, if unwelcome, scientific opportunity. Earthquakes in well-studied regions add incremental data to an already substantial body of research. An earthquake in a poorly studied, historically quiet region like the Texas Panhandle provides comparatively rare insight into how ancient, deeply buried fault systems behave under stress, information that can meaningfully improve scientific understanding of intraplate seismicity more broadly, a topic that remains less well understood than seismicity along active plate boundaries, specifically because qualifying events are so much less common that scientific value does little to comfort residents dealing with the immediate aftermath, however. Local officials across the affected towns spent Thursday coordinating structural inspections of older buildings, checking for any damage that may not have been immediately visible, and fielding continued reports from residents describing the unfamiliar experience of feeling their homes shake for the first time. School districts and local government buildings in several communities conducted precautionary inspections before resuming normal operations, a standard precaution following any earthquake of this magnitude regardless of region. So when an earthquake shakes a place that has not seen anything like it in over 100 years, the story rarely ends once the shaking itself stops. It shifts into a slower, more careful phase, one built on seismic data, historical fault mapping, and careful analysis of nearby industrial activity, all working toward an answer that residents, regulators, and scientists alike are waiting on with genuine uncertainty. Whatever that answer turns out to be, one thing is already clear. The ground beneath the Texas Panhandle just proved it is capable of far more than a century of quiet history ever suggested, and scientists are not yet willing to say with confidence why.